Well, I think it's 10:01. I think we'll get started, Roy. And hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be today. My name is Chris Kilford, and I'm the president of CIC Victoria here on Vancouver Island. And I'd like to welcome our CIC members and our guests today, and our guest speaker. And I'm glad you were able to take the time to join us this morning.
My pleasure.
Before we do get underway officially, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of Lekwungen speaking First Peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, and we gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish nations on whose traditional territories we are meeting here today. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, membership-driven think tank with an express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's role in the world. I think what makes us different from many think tanks is that we have branches in 17 Canadian cities with close to 1,400 members, even a new branch in Prince George that started late last year. And you can find more about CIC and us in Victoria just by Googling the Canadian International Council. And here on the island, we have close to 450 members in the branch, including 100 students. And if you want to join this great group that we have, I'll put my email address up in the chat box, and by all means, get in touch with me. What we're going to do for today is, after a little bit of a situational preamble by me, I'm going to turn the floor over to our guest speaker, the Honorable Roy Cullen, who will speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have an audience Q&A portion. And for the Q&A, if you can just scroll, bring your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Q&A area. And if you type your questions in there, that'll be great. If they end up in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that as well. And we're also recording this event for those that are not able to join us here this morning. So let's go to the main event. And by way of background, in May 2019, the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia issued an order in council establishing a commission of inquiry into money laundering in British Columbia. The commission was established in the wake of growing public concern regarding the nature and extent of money laundering in British Columbia, as well as the effectiveness of those responsible for preventing it. According to the media, a staggering amount of money was being laundered through lower mainland casinos, and money laundering was becoming a problem in other sectors of the economy as well. As the Commission's interim report released in November 2020 notes, money laundering is a crime that strikes at the heart of our collective values and corrupts the fabric of a free and democratic society. Now, the evidentiary phase of the commission is scheduled to run until May 2021, with a view to assessing if money laundering is a problem worth addressing, whether it is possible to quantify the volume of illicit funds being laundered through the BC economy, and the common methods and techniques used to launder these illicit funds, and other areas to combating money laundering, such as barriers to effective law enforcement. Now, I read a few days ago that the Commissioner, Austin Cullen, who has no relationship to Roy, has ruled that a portion of the Commission's hearings tomorrow will be held in camera, which means that it will not be accessible to the public. And only the participants and their legal counsel will be allowed to view this portion of the hearings that day. And there'll be no notes taken. And the reason why this is being done is the Commission is hearing evidence from a panel of the 3 chief anti-money laundering officers from Scotiabank, the Royal Bank, and the HSBC Canada Bank. And they don't want any of that to get out into the public realm. So, on the issue of money laundering, we're delighted to have an expert here today, and that is the Honorable Roy Cullen. And many of you, I think, know Roy, but if you don't, he was initially elected to the House of Commons in a by-election in 1996 in the riding of Etobicoke North, and was then re-elected in the 1997, 2000, 2004, and 2006 general elections. He retired from the House of Commons in 2008. As a member of Prime Minister Jean Chrétien's government and later under Prime Minister Paul Martin, he served as chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, as parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance, and as parliamentary secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. In 2008, his book, The Poverty of Corrupt Nations, was also published. Now, during his tenure as parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Finance, Roy was actively involved in designing and implementing Canada's anti-money laundering regime. And he has also been very active with the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption in the international fight against corruption and money laundering. He has spoken out on these scourges a number of times and played a leadership role at several anti-corruption and anti-money laundering workshops and conferences. I don't think here in this country we could have a person more qualified to speak to us on this subject today. And Roy, welcome to CIC Victoria and CIC, and I'm going to hand over the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for this opportunity and the CIC organization, and thanks to those of you that are participating today. What I'll do is I'll load my PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully this will work. And while I'm doing that, I just would like to say that my presentation is based on an essay that I wrote in February 2020, and that essay is to some extent incorporates some of the comments that I made when I appeared in front of the Cullen Commission in November 2019. So in the year 2000, Canada introduced legislation and passed legislation to create Canada's anti-money laundering regime. We were the last G7 country to do that, but as you can imagine and appreciate, I'm sure, in the mid-1990s, Canada was very much dealing with the challenges, the fiscal challenges facing our country at the time. But being one of the last G7 countries, we also had a lot of experience to draw on, and in fact, Finance Canada, the Minister of Finance, as well as the House of Commons Finance Committee, talked to a number of different people and organizations and countries. And in fact, the House of Commons Finance Committee had hearings where we listened to what seemed to be working and what wasn't. And at the time, we introduced the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act, which established Canada's Financial Intelligence Unit, or it's called the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada, or Fintrac, as it is more affectionately referred to. And as parliamentary secretary to the then Minister of Finance, I had the honor to shepherd legislation through the House of Commons and through a Senate committee. At the time, based on our benchmarking and our hearings and our analysis, we believed that the Fintrac, the Financial Intelligence Unit, was well mandated. It was the governance model seemed to be right for us, and it was well resourced. So we were quite confident as we embarked on that in the year 2000. And in years subsequent, I had the honor to attend a number of meetings of the Egmont Group. The Egmont Group is the international organization of financial intelligence units around the world. And I could tell from those meetings that Fintrac and the Canadian anti-money laundering regime was held in quite high regard. Well, things started to change in British Columbia and indeed across Canada in the year 2015, when images of people appearing at casinos in British Columbia with bags, duffel bags filled with $20 bills wrapped in elastic bands, and they were being escorted to the VIP lounge. And that there was clearly a bias that seemed to be in play, that the money was probably clean. And I'll come back to that later. And the regulatory environment was very lax at that time as well. So I'll come back to those points later.
Roy, could I just, it's Chris here. Do you have PowerPoint slides that you're?
Yes, I thought I loaded them.
You have to share screen.
That's what I did, I thought. Let me try again. share screen, and then I go to my PowerPoint, right?
Yeah, but it's not showing up.
Okay, hang on, I'll find it again. Okay, is it there now?
No, it's not.
The file is safe to open. We scanned it.
I've made you a co-host. Could you try that again?
What do you mean? Go back to the original?
Go down to the share screen again and share your screen. Try it again.
Not coming up?
No. So let's. You're doing quite well without them, Roy.
Okay.
We'll just carry on without the slides.
I'm not sure what happened there, but anyway. Okay, so
Great.
in 2018, it was estimated by Dr. Peter German. Dr. Peter German was retained by the government of British Columbia to investigate what was going on with the money laundering in British Columbia. And he is a retired deputy commissioner of the RCMP. And he estimated that in 2018, the money laundered in British Columbia was $7 billion. And of course, it's not limited to British Columbia. Across Canada, he estimated there was $41 billion that was laundered, dirty money that was laundered in 2018 as well. So the casinos seem to be the first tip of the iceberg in British Columbia. And the estimate was that between the years 2010 and 2016, about $1.7 billion of dirty money was laundered through BC's casinos. So Dr. German in his report did a pretty exhaustive review and came up with 48 recommendations, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Just by way of context, in 2016, the Financial Action Task Force with the FATF, which is based in Paris, is the G7 enterprise that has the responsibility for setting anti-money laundering standards worldwide. In 2016, they did a review of Canada's anti-money laundering regime, and generally the report was reasonably positive, but they did point to what they felt was a gaping hole in the regime, and that was the fact that lawyers were not required by law to report suspicious transactions. I should say that in 2000, when we brought in the legislation, lawyers were required to report suspicious transactions, but the lawyers in Canada took this to the Supreme Court, and in 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that lawyers were not required to report suspicious transactions on the basis of lawyer-client privilege. Now, there's been much work in between to establish certain protocols, but it's not right on point in terms of a legislative requirement. So as Chris mentioned, the BC government, through David Eby, the Attorney General, and the Premier launched the Cullen Commission into money laundering. I'll go to the next slide, but the slides aren't working, so it doesn't much matter, I guess. Where is this money coming from? Where is this dirty money coming from, and how is it laundered? Well, of course, any money that it's laundered, dirty money, comes from some traditional sources, regrettably: transnational crime, drug dealers, kleptocrats, corrupt money, human smuggling, and human trafficking. But in addition, there seems to be a large flow coming from the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong to some extent as well. And if we look at the geopolitics with British Columbia and China, there are huge connections, both culturally and economically. In fact, it's estimated that by the year 2036, 20.8% of the people in Vancouver will be of Chinese descent. Another metric foreign direct investment from the People's Republic to Canada grew on average 19% annually from 2007 to 2017. And in fact, unfortunately, there's a professor in Australia, John Langdale, who came up with the term the Vancouver model of money laundering or snow washing. And that's made it around in the world of money launderers and anti-money launderers and other fora. And so what people do, these money exchange people, is they assist people from China circumvent the exchange control restrictions, which are quite tight. And the money then flows to Vancouver, where through various mechanisms and means it's laundered through casinos, through real estate, and through other companies and trusts. And it's also, we do know that the People's Republic of China is a highly corrupt country, and much of the money flowing from China is corrupt money or otherwise criminal money. I mean, some of it, I'm sure, to be sure, is clean money, but a lot of it that is not the case. In fact, it's estimated that in China, the gross domestic product, 15% of that is taken up with corruption. And the RCMP has talked about the participation in the the real estate market in BC, assisted by Chinese triads and tongs. To cap all this off, there was weak enforcement of the money laundering rules and some institutional problems that I'll come to in a moment that made it easy for people to launder money in British Columbia. And the drug problem continued to grow. The fentanyl problem and opioid crisis, drug dealers, when they find it easy to launder their dirty money, the activity increases. It probably would have increased in any case, but it just exacerbates the problem. And in fact, in 2016, it's estimated there were 931 deaths in British Columbia as a result of opioids. Now, just to talk about context a bit, in terms of the institutions in British Columbia, we have the British Columbia Lottery Corporation, which has exclusive responsibility for the conduct and management of gaming, including casinos, on behalf of the province. It's a Crown corporation, and in fiscal 2018-2019, the corporation generated a net income of $1.4 billion for the province. The other key player is the Gaming Policy and Enforcement Branch of the British Columbia government that regulates all gaming operations, including gaming conducted, managed, and operated by the BC Lottery Corporation. And they have a specific mandate to ensure the overall integrity of gaming. So just coming back to one of my key recommendations is to bring lawyers into the reporting regime of Canada of suspicious transactions, making sure it's charter-proof. And there are models that exist that could help to get us to that point. The other recommendation I have is that Dr. Peter German's report, his 48 recommendations, that they be acted on by the government. They're all pretty solid. And in fact, the BC government, through the Attorney General, and he advised us that the full cabinet is behind implementing all 48 recommendations. And in fact, they are in the process of doing that right now. There was a very weak regulatory environment. There was a lot of confusion between the role of the regulator, the Gaming Policy and Enforcement Branch, and the BC Lottery Corporation. And as I said earlier, there seemed to be a bias right through the whole system to assume that the money was clean rather than dirty. And so the know your customer techniques, the due diligence was sadly lacking. So a couple of the key recommendations from Dr. German that I've highlighted are the need to have a new independent gaming regulator, to change the governance of the regulator so it is at arm's length from the government. Also to ensure that the BC Lottery, that suspicious transactions are not cleared through from casinos to the BC Lottery Corporation, as it is now, or it was a few months ago, where the BC Lottery Corporation would decide, based on what casinos reported as potentially suspicious transactions, the Lottery Corporation would vet those and send on the reports to the Fintrac, the Financial Intelligence Unit in Canada. So that has to change. Needless to say, the BC Lottery Corporation is not in agreement with all of Dr. German's reports, but all his recommendations, I should say, but I'm sure this will have to be sorted out in a positive way in the near future. So, as I say, casinos were sort of the thin edge of the wedge, in my judgment. And in 2018, it's estimated that $5 billion was laundered through real estate in British Columbia. In fact, Maureen Maloney, in her panel report in 2018 or 2019, I think, estimated that 72% of money laundered in British Columbia is through the real estate sector. And in fact, a study some years ago of RCMP files determined that a majority of money laundered in Canada was through the real estate sector. And there's a couple of things in play here. One, it doesn't seem that real estate agents are properly trained or they're following through on the reporting mechanisms. It's not very pleasant, I'm sure, for a real estate agent to tell a customer that the $500 million in cash that is going to pay for the house has to be reported to Fintrac as a suspicious transaction. So what's happened in the meantime is that the BC government has announced its intention to create a new regulator for the BC real estate sector by 2021. And in parallel with this move, the Real Estate Council of British Columbia is launching a mandatory anti-money laundering course for BC real estate agents and property managers. And both these are positive steps. So you have this confluence of events. You have poor enforcement, and I'm coming to some of the aspects of that in a moment. And then you have the biases and the conflicts of interest, essentially, to report suspicious transactions when it might negatively affect your business. So one of the key elements in dealing with real estate, in fact, companies and trusts generally, is to have a registry of beneficial ownership. The beneficial owner is the person or organization that has the economic interest in the real estate or the company or the trust. And you have to have that because when the amounts get large for people that are laundering money, they create layers of companies often that have nominee directors, nominee shareholders, and they're layered and stacked, maybe 7 or 8 companies. So even with the best of due diligence, it's difficult to ascertain who the real owner of that company or trust is. And often the way it's done, it's some dirty money being laundered at the front end. So a registry is needed of beneficial ownership. In my report, I also talk about my essay and my presentation to the Cullen Commission, talk about it's great having a beneficial ownership registry. And in fact, it's even better if you can have it publicly available. But even if it's available only to law enforcement and other government agencies, it's a first step. But there has to be due diligence. There have to be resources attached to that so that declarations of beneficial owners can be vetted to make sure that they are truthful. And there also has to be, in my judgment, accountability. So if the false declarations are made, there will be sanctions, serious sanctions that could include freezing of money or eventually confiscating of money. Now, in the United Kingdom in 2016, they were the first country really that brought in they had a public beneficial ownership registry. They deal with lots of money coming in from kleptocrats, et cetera, from all over the world, essentially. And so they established this registry. But a study in 2018 by Global Witness, which is a reputable NGO, non-governmental organization, they looked at some of these declarations and they found them to be severely lacking, seriously lacking. In some cases, the persons declared there was no beneficial owner. In other cases, they were infants or other things. So it's fine to have transparency, but you need to back it up with due diligence and accountabilities. So that's what I've recommended. And the BC government has already implemented a registry for real estate, and they're working on one for all companies and trusts. This has to be done as a matter of urgency. In fact, the federal government is doing that as well. So what are the costs and the impacts of money laundering in British Columbia? Well, they're quite enormous. First of all, there's a very general corrupting influence on society. When people see that their institutions are not getting the job done, they're not dealing with criminality and the laundering of dirty money, it creates a lot of cynicism, more cynicism. It generates a lack of confidence in the public institutions, and it also destabilizes financial markets. There are other two major cost items in British Columbia. One is the opioid crisis, which has been helped along with the ease with which drug dealers can launder dirty money. In fact, as I said, in 2016, there were 931 deaths in British Columbia as a result of the opioid crisis. And a recent government lawsuit totals $9.1 billion, where they are suing 40 pharmaceutical firms and distributors, producers and distributors of OxyContin, to recover public health costs associated with opioid abuse. Now, I'm sure that that dollar amount is probably overstated somewhat, but nonetheless, it's a huge dollar value. The other impact is that Maureen Maloney and her panel concluded that there was a 5% increase in housing prices as a result of the ease with which money was laundered through the real estate sector. And that has an impact on homelessness. In fact, although I couldn't find any specific studies for British Columbia, in New York, for example, a study that was done in 2017 concluded that a 5% average increase in prices would lead to nearly 3,000 more people falling into homelessness. And in Washington, D.C., the model predicted additional 224 additional homeless people as a result of a 5% increase in housing costs. So these are not insignificant amounts, although they're smallish. They're still important when we have the huge homeless crisis that we do have. We should understand, however, that money laundering is not limited to Canada or British Columbia. In fact, recently, New York's financial regulator said that banks and governments have allowed money laundering to, the term he used is metastasize, inside the banking system, and they revealed sweeping failures by global banks to stop illicit financial flows. So moving along to the next slide, which you can't see. The prosecutions of money launderers in Canada and in British Columbia is very, very low. In fact, from 2000 to 2016 in Canada, there were 321 guilty verdicts in money laundering cases, and that's much lower than the USA and the United Kingdom. The conviction rate in UK is 50%, USA 85%. And there are a number of reasons for that. I believe that law enforcement and also prosecutors are more comfortable laying charges on what we call a predicate offense. So in other words, drug dealers, easier to lay charges on drug dealers than the same people that laundered the dirty money. Money laundering is a little more technical, and also police that are more comfortable with dealing with charges against the predicate offense. There also may be the erroneous view that to prosecute money laundering, you need to identify a predicate offense. But in fact, the Criminal Code of Canada is explicit in stating that charges for money laundering offenses may be laid, notwithstanding the absence of charges relating to a predicate offense. You need only prove that the money launderer knew or believed that the funds came from illegal activities. And in fact, that position is consistent with the standards set by the Financial Action Task Force. So what I've recommended is that the Attorney General of Canada and the Provincial Attorneys General mount a very strenuous training and education program for federal and provincial prosecutors and law enforcement agencies to encourage the laying of charges for money laundering offenses, notwithstanding the absence of charges being laid for the predicate offense. So my last slide is lessons learned. With the interest of time, I'm not going to go over all of those because many of them flow from the recommendations and the conclusions that I've reached in my presentation. but just to highlight a couple of them. One, that casinos often is the tip of the iceberg. So once in any jurisdiction, once problems are identified, it really behooves the jurisdiction to start investigating seriously and taking action. As I said before, beneficial ownership registries are important, but they need to be accompanied with due diligence, and they need to have accountability. And the other key thing is the need to prosecute, because money laundering charges, if they're successful and if the word gets out that money laundering offenses are being attacked, then the idea there is for it to be a deterrent to criminality. So I will stop there, and I apologize for the lack of a PowerPoint, but I think the gist of it is in the points that I made, and I look forward to all your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. And I have to say the consensus seemed to be that getting away from a PowerPoint was the best thing ever. So that was good to hear. Thank you for that. You've touched on a lot of really important points. We have some questions in the Q&A area, but I also have one, and I wanted to just launch into this one first. So my apologies to everybody watching. I learned a lot preparing for today. I wasn't aware that the term money laundering had come about because of Al Capone laundering the proceeds of his illicit activities through his coin washing laundry operations in Chicago. I didn't realize that here in Canada that the Egmont Group has its secretariat in Toronto, and 166 financial intelligence units from those countries are the secretariats in Toronto. I wasn't aware that Canada was playing such a significant role. But my question comes to China, because you mentioned China and the inflow of money that does come from China. And it appeared to me from the research that I did that China has actually become a little bit more serious about combating money laundering in their country. They've been ramping up punishments. They were supposed to hold a big international conference last year that got canceled because of COVID-19. And I was wondering, in your view, is China actually taking money laundering serious, or is this a problem that's just out of control and they just can't get a grip on it?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for the question. First of all, yes, the Egmont Group for many years was located in Toronto, but they've recently moved to Ottawa. But yeah, it's great to have that group based here in Canada. In going without my slides on the screen, I missed, if I may, I missed an important slide. If I could just briefly speak to that before I get back to your question. The role of the federal government in money laundering is pretty important, largely through the Financial Intelligence Unit, Fintrac, through the Department of Justice in terms of legislation, the Attorney General in terms of prosecutions, and the RCMP in terms of enforcement. And there have been some weaknesses developed in the role of these entities over the years, in my judgment. First of all, the RCMP used to have a proceeds of crime unit in many of the divisions across Canada, and in British Columbia, it's Division E, based in Vancouver. And I know that over time, that proceeds of crime unit was disbanded. And that meant that leads that were provided by Fintrac were often not followed up, and not surprisingly, because there were a lack of resources to do that. So one of my other recommendations is that proceeds of crime unit be reestablished in Division E and indeed across Canada. The other part, I think, is Fintrac doesn't lay blameless here either. I think that they've done a less than adequate job of making sure that reporting entities of suspicious transactions are being reported. And there's some anecdotal evidence of that, and some other evidence that people and organizations in British Columbia and perhaps across Canada aren't reporting the suspicious transactions the way they should be, and there's not an adequate follow-up. So those are a couple of my recommendations. With respect to the People's Republic of China, I'm not an expert on China. And I do know that over time, they do have a history of reacting and then backing off. For example, in China for many years, they would do a roundup of all the corrupt people, take them to the local town square, and they'd be executed. And then things would get back to normal much later. I hope the Chinese are taking this seriously. Part of it might be in their own self-interest, that they know now that a lot of money is escaping the People's Republic. Some of it because of fraudulent activity and criminality other than corruption. And they might be losing out on capital outflows, and hopefully pressures from OECD countries and others is coming to bear as well. So I can't answer your question specifically, Chris. I hope that they are taking it more seriously. But when you look at on the trade file, I mean, I read a couple of years ago a report that was commissioned by the US Congress on how well or unwell China has complied with the WTO rules and regulations when China came into the WTO. And although it's prepared, I think, by the USTR, and I'm sure it was somewhat politicized, but it reads like a long book of non-compliance with WTO regs. So I wouldn't necessarily hang my hat on it that things are changing for the better, but I certainly hope so.
Thank you. And I have a question from Murray here in Victoria, and he's asking if you can walk us through the process that happens at the casinos. The money comes in these bags, people are purchasing chips, and then they're returning the chips. Can you enlighten us as to how such huge sums of money are actually laundered? What happens physically in the casino? Yes,
well, casinos under Canada's legislation and regulations are deemed reporting entities. So they are required to report suspicious transactions. And there's a de facto initial limit of anything over $10,000. In fact, we've all previously probably experienced that $10,000 when we come across the border and we're asked if we're carrying more than $10,000 in cash. So that 10,000 is an international moniker that we've zeroed in on to set a benchmark. But any other suspicious transactions are defined ad nauseum in the Fintrac guidelines and regulations. And so what was happening was that these people were arriving. Clearly, in the case of $20 bills wrapped in elastic bands was dirty money, or 95% chance. But they'd immediately be escorted if the amounts were, let's say, $3-4 million or more, escorted to the VIP lounge, because this was serious. These were serious gamblers. And at the time, later on, they interviewed some of the people that checked them into the VIP lounge, and they were asked, weren't you concerned that it might have been dirty money? Well, they were saying, well, we didn't have any evidence, and there was nothing to indicate that it was dirty. And so there was that bias. And in fact, as Peter German pointed out, and the RCMP have commented in their testimony, there were really a lot of people concluding, including the RCMP, that there were problems in the casinos. And this was reported up to very high levels in the BC government. But I think that bias, that the money might be clean, pervaded. And rather than saying, it could be dirty, the bias was the other way. And I think that went up to some of the higher levels of the government. In fact, in the Cullen Commission's interim report, they allude to that, and they say they're going to be doing more work in that area. Because when we look at it, of course, money, whether it's dirty or clean, that's going through the casinos is creating revenue and going to the bottom line, a lot of that for the BC government. So I think there was a bias not to do anything. We had other things, regulators, for example, the Attorney General Eby has fixed this now, but regulators were on site in the casinos from 9 to 5 weekdays. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out when the money launderers would arrive. It'd be after hours or on the weekends. So that's been fixed. But so what happens is they come in, let's say with $4 million, they buy chips and they go to the tables and they start gambling. And after a certain point in time, they're able to cash out. And so they could if they cash out and ask, they could get a check. And once it's in a check form from XYZ Casino, they go to a bank and deposit it. And they talk about, the gambling they did, and they just checked out, or they won all this money. And because the bank would ask them some questions. But with a check, it's not like cash, so they'd be able to deposit that money. So that's the way it's cleaned, is they convert the dirty money into clean money with a check from the casino. The other thing that happens when you have a lot of the dirty money flowing through real estate and a lot of kleptocrats who are multimillionaires, they'll come to the casinos with the dirty money and they'll just sit at the high stakes tables and gamble until they win or until they lose it all. They don't really, it's not really that significant for them. But the main method is just to gamble it and then cash out and with a check and deposit it.
Roy, we had a question about the rules that you've been speaking about. Do they apply to the casinos that are on First Nations lands, for example?
Good question. I believe they do. I believe they do, because I know that when we set it up in 2000, everybody wanted to be exempt, of course. It seemed when we brought in, when the GST was around, actually it was brought in by Brian Mulroney, but we extended it, and there were thousands and thousands of people and organizations that wanted exemption from the GST. The same was true for the reporting suspicious transactions. We decided to make the tent very big, and then over time decide what we could delete from that, based on experience. For example, we included churches, because you also need to realize that money launderers go to the weakest link. And you have, let's say, biker gangs. If churches are excluded, they might be able to find a church to launder their dirty money through. So we made the tent very big. And I'd be surprised if casinos on indigenous properties were excluded, but I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I can't recall, frankly, so sorry about that. But I expect they are included, because otherwise, guess where the launderers would go,
So coming back to Fintrac, and Fintrac was established in 2000, I think. It has, I believe, a good reputation, although as Hugh points out, it seems that they're not willing to share with the Cullen Commission. I'm not 100% sure on that. And at times, it appears that Fintrac isn't really following up. I know they have to hand off what they find to law enforcement, but it just seems that perhaps we're not doing as good a job as we could with Fintrac. And this ties into a question from Scott, who says, given the extent of money laundering here, shouldn't we be creating a new federal organized crime law enforcement agency, as we've seen elsewhere in the UK and Australia, to combat money laundering? So I guess the question is, is Fintrac good enough, or do we need something else?
Well, it's a good question. I know it's been raised about the effectiveness. I think that one of the problems was that in forming it was the privacy was one of the predominant concerns. In fact, when I took it through committee in the House and the Senate, and I was briefed by the department and heard from other stakeholders, privacy was a key concern. So that the way it works now with Fintrac is that Fintrac will report suspicious transactions. They do use various algorithms and analytical tools, but if they see something that is sort of uniquely suspicious, they'll fire it off to the RCMP or the CSIS or the Canada Border Services Agency. Then if those authorities believe that there's something really going on here, they have to seek federal court judge approval to get additional information from Fintrac, so that then the full information package would be released to the RCMP or these other agencies. And so privacy, in Canada is a big issue. And we had to, we were stepping on eggshells with the privacy matter. We had to get the legislation through. We were the last G7 countries. So that's how we structured it. And the legislation passed very, very quickly. I think what's happening now with Fintrac and its work with the Cullen Commission, I think privacy issues are part of the concern. I think regrettably, and this is just me reading between the lines, I think there's some turf stuff going on here as well, because when you look at money laundering, The key responsibilities are really with the federal government through Fintrac and through the RCMP. And so there may be a bit of that cat and mouse going on. I don't know. I hope not. But I think that lately, I think Commissioner Cullen has reported that the information is more free flowing than it had been. But I know that privacy is a very big concern. So I wouldn't fault Fintrac if that, as long as they're not overreacting and being overly cautious, and that may be part of it as well. Is Fintrac, are there other models? There could well be. I'd prefer, my preference, and I'll declare my bias, of course, because I was part of launching the initial scheme. I think that there are ways in which we can make this scheme work, but what happens with, like, for example, the RCMP, and you can't really blame them, when the proceeds of crime units were disbanded, economic crime is viewed as sort of a victimless crime, generally speaking, right? And so if you're having to deal with drug dealers, fentanyl dealers, and you have to dealing with, of course, after 9/11, there was a huge emphasis on terrorism. So the RCMP in its wisdom decided to fold that proceeds of crime unit. And a lot of it comes down to resources. Where are you going to put your resources? And I think if Canada and British Columbia and the public is serious about money laundering and dealing with it, they need to put additional resources into the RCMP and to Fintrac, and maybe redesign and rejig some of the mandates of the Fintrac so that they have full authority and the tools and the mechanisms they need to deal with entities that are meant to report and who may be not doing that. So large sanctions, large number of audits. I think it can work. But having said all that, it's somewhat of an elusive target. It's very difficult. Even financial institutions or financial intermediaries who are really have strong business ethics and they want to deal with money laundering, if nothing else, for their brand and their reputational risk. By the time you get through and you have layers of 7 or 8 different companies, some of them offshore, and with nominee directors, nominee shareholders, it becomes a brutal task in the complex cases. So I think we have to realize that we're not going to get 100% performance, but that my preference would be to try to fix what we have in place rather than reinventing the wheel.
A lot of the questions, and we've had quite a number come in, and so thank you for everybody for participating. But a lot of them do speak to the impact that money laundering has on a country or on a province. It sort of undermines everything, the rule of law, real estate agents potentially getting kickbacks, people in government turning a blind eye, and so on. It just makes everything fall a few layers down. Do you see, in your work, looking at institutions and companies, businesses, and so forth, do you get a sense that things have hit rock bottom, in a sense that we're in a really bad place that we need to dig ourselves out of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally an optimist, but as one of your executives, Mary Collins, will know, I don't know if she's on this call, but I've spoken out about how the public cynicism and lack of confidence in public institutions, some of it, a lot of it, deservedly so, because politicians will say one thing and do another. Politicians will breach the public trust by being corrupt or using their public knowledge for private gain. And so I think there's an amount of cynicism, and as my theory goes, as Mary will know, that this, to me, is leading to a lot of this populist movement where citizens are becoming very cynical about the traditional institutions of government. And they're saying, well, we can't trust them. Let's go with some populist leader. At least he or she is saying the right things. And it's a search for, often simple answers to complex problems. So yeah, I think we have some work to do in trying to tidy things up. And the unfortunate thing is when I served in the House of Commons and when I met parliamentarians around the world, I would say, I don't know what the exact metric is, but the vast, vast, vast majority are people that want to make their countries better and they're ethical people. But it's like everything else. It's the 10% that spoil it for everybody else. So I think as a society, internationally, not only in Canada, we have to, get away to some extent to this notion that governments have to be small and governments aren't, there's no useful role for them. And when we go around and we look at some of the things that governments can do and are doing, even from basic infrastructure, we should realize that maybe we have to resource it properly to get it done. There's no point, when I dealt with some politicians in Latin America, not to pick on them, but they had very, very good legislation dealing with corruption and money laundering. The legislation was perfect, but there was no follow-up. For example, on money laundering, some of them didn't even have a financial intelligence unit. So, a lot of it is just face-saving stuff, and it's just not good enough in today's age. And so I think we have some work to do to reconnect with the public and gain their confidence again. At least I'm talking about elected officials and senior government officials and all government officials, really.
I'm tying in a couple of questions here because people are saying, Fintrac and the RCMP, they, as you said, they don't have the resources, don't have the expertise. I've got potentially one of the folks on the call here that would be willing to volunteer to help out in that area, but they don't have the resources. And potentially part of that reason is, as you say, it's not seen as a major issue as an economic crime. But then if you go into the Cullen Commission's interim report from just a few months ago, some of the experts there are saying that it's we're actually wasting our efforts. They say we're spending tens of billions of dollars in Europe, for example. The banks in Europe are spending tens of billions of dollars on anti-money laundering, and really not making a dent into the whole thing. So I was quite actually surprised to see some of this in the Cullen report, and it runs counter to everything we've been talking to today. Have you encountered these experts also saying that perhaps it's just not worth the effort because it's such a small percentage of the global economy?
Yeah, I've read about it. I must say I haven't met anyone face to face making that proposition, but I know that sort of thinking is around. I mean, it's not dissimilar to, there are those who would argue that, hard drugs should be decriminalized because we're making no headway on the war really on drugs. I've never been a big subscriber to those views, although it's becoming more compelling when you look at what's happening. I think that I know when we set up the anti-money laundering regime in Canada, one of the key things was how do we measure success? And the difficulty is it's sometimes complex to trace, reports that are submitted by Fintrac to law enforcement and ultimate prosecutions, particularly if, as I mentioned in my presentation, police are more comfortable laying charges on the predicate offense and not on the money laundering offense. I still believe that having that deterrent is so critical. In fact, the work that I've done over the years with GOPAC, the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, it was launched in Canada in 2002, and I've been involved since the outset. And the membership, we actually had our formative meeting in the chamber of the House of Commons, and it's been going on since then. We have about 700 members globally in about 55 countries. But the membership resoundingly said at that time that we need to deal with corruption, but in a parallel way, we have to deal with money laundering. And these were like parliamentarians from around the world. Some of the countries, of course, more concerned about corrupt money flowing out, and other countries more concerned about corrupt money flowing in, but they have to be really dealt with in its totality. My own judgment would be, I don't think we should give up on it. The same way that I don't think we're ready to give up on decriminalizing or taking, making drugs, hard drugs legal. I understand the arguments, but I'm more of a thinker that we should make sure we give the resources and the mandate to the entities that are supposed to be doing the job. And if it's still not working, then maybe let's revisit it.
I do have a couple of other questions I want to get to from Karen. She asks, what is the currency of choice for money laundering? And I guess it also ties into another question. Currency of choice, and where does Canada fit on the global scale when it comes to money laundering? Are we the currency of choice?
No, I think like most things, the currency of choice would be hard currencies like mostly the US dollar. No, it's I think of course, when you're getting money out of, let's say, China, I'm not familiar with all the mechanics of it, whether the money is initially in renminbi, or then it comes into Vancouver in Canadian dollars. But I think those are just tools and mechanisms. When you get to casinos in British Columbia, the people that would arrive with the money in the duffel bags would be Canadian dollars currency. And that would be largely, when it's in $20 bills wrapped in elastic bands, it would be drug dealers. In fact, there was evidence, and this came out in the Cullen Commission, I think, or maybe Peter German's report. There were loan sharks visibly in the parking lots of a lot of the casinos. So they had dirty money that they were loaning to casino, gamblers. Another way of laundering the money. No, I think the other thing that's coming up, of course, is Bitcoin and these other types of currencies, which is gaining a lot of prominence in the money laundering world. And there's all other types of mechanisms. If you look at the wahalas, now usually they're the smaller amounts, but they've been getting bigger, where people in a local country will go to a wahala dealer and pay in local currency, and then the money will appear, let's say in British Columbia or Toronto, wherever, in Canadian dollars. So there's no real trail there. Generally, it's been smaller amounts, but that's building up as well, as is Bitcoin. So I think it's just a matter of expediency. Money launderers in Canada, I'm sure, would have no trouble dealing with dirty US dollars or any other Deutschmarks or whatever, or euros.
Roy, thank you for that. And I see that we're coming up to 11 o'clock. Our hour has whizzed by. Before I get to any sort of final remarks to say thanks to you, is there anything that you would like to leave us with this morning?
No, just to thank everybody for their interest. And if anyone wants to get a hold of me or follow up with any questions, my website, roycullen.com, it's got my email address there. Sometimes I think that's a mistake, but generally speaking, it's a way to communicate. So I apologize about the PowerPoint. And it hasn't happened before, but it can happen. I know that. And but thank you all for your participation. And I just an emphasis, don't give up. We can fix this, but it's going to take a commitment by everybody, the general public, our elected people, and it can get done. I think it's been shown to me that the Attorney General here in British Columbia, David Eby, has a real bias for action, and he's doing things. The government is doing things. So, and the Cullen Commission could point in the number of very important directions. So I think just stay tuned, and we'll get the job done, I'm sure.
Well, Roy, thank you so much on behalf of us all. I should make it known to everybody that Roy is a new member of CIC Victoria. So welcome, Roy, to our group. And thank you, everybody, for participating today. We do have a number of events coming up in the next little while. And I should also mention, Roy, I'll get your slides from you if you don't mind. Yeah. And I'll get them out to the folks that were here today if they wish.
I was about to suggest that. Yeah, I can send you my PowerPoint, and then if anyone wants it, it's there. Yeah.
And on the new events, next week we have a career panel with our students out at UVic. We have 4 excellent panelists. They'll be talking about their careers and the lessons learned. And it's designed for students, but it's also, I think, something that everybody could participate in. One of our panelists, Sandra Leduc, has climbed Mount Everest and many, many other mountains around the world. And so I think that's going to be a lot of fun. And then we have Lee Sardi with Global Affairs Canada coming up in early February, and he'll be talking about Russia and China. It's a closed talk just for CIC Victoria members because he's still a member of Global Affairs Canada, and he will be talking about, as I mentioned, Russia and China and Canadian foreign policy issues. So we got an exciting program coming up. But to close us out today, thank you again, Roy. Thanks everybody for participating. And have a great rest of the day. Take care.